Let's talk about how pilots can stay proficient. There have been several recent Form 5 failures in Pennsylvania wing, and most Form 5 failures are results of lack of proficiency. Having a dedicated practice flight before your Form 5 is a good idea, but if your base level of proficiency is low, 1 or 2 flights will not help. However, lack of proficiency doesn't only lead to a failed Form 5, it can lead to an accident as well. Under pressure, you don't rise to the occasion, you sink to the level of your training. The authorship of this quote is debatable, but it's true nevertheless. And there are several excuses that pilots have. Not enough flying opportunities, I don't get to fly enough to practice, or the opposite, I have to fly so much that I don't have time to do a proficiency flight. And there's always overconfidence when people think that they are good enough and they don't need to practice. So how can you stay proficient? Well, first of all, you can request an A12 flight and fly a proficiency profile per standards 71-4. You can also do a self-funded proficiency flight per standards 71-5. But another thing you can do is treating every flight as a proficiency flight. For example, before takeoff, you can build a flight plan. Don't just use direct to button. You'll be asked to build one on Form 5. Select extra waypoints you can add to the plan. And don't add them sequentially all the time. You can do departure and destination, and then add a couple more waypoints in between. And the waypoints you select don't have to be really far from the straight line between you and your destination. You can always select something on the way, like a VOR intersection, a GPS waypoint, an airport, or you can create a user waypoint. Then load an airway. If you're going east on an IFR flight plan, you'll most likely have to do it, and sometimes you will have to do it in the air. So be proficient in that aspect will be very useful. Then a takeoff. Instead of doing normal takeoff all the time, do a soft field takeoff, but be mindful of the right turn tendencies. You need to add enough right rudder to keep your nose pointing down the runway. Do a short field takeoff, same thing. Don't forget about the right rudder. Calculate your performance before the flight and see how close you are to the numbers. That will not only give you practice in calculating your performance, but you will also learn the capabilities of your airplane and yourself, and you can know how close you can be to the published numbers. And if you ever have to do a short field takeoff in real life, you'll be more confident knowing that you can take off in a certain distance if needed. In cruise, trim and lean. That's an important part, because if you're not lean properly, you will not make your published fuel consumption numbers, because the fuel consumption, published fuel consumption, assumes that you're lean according to the POH. And trimming is important as well, especially in a 182 that requires rudder trim. If you're not trimmed, you'll be flying in a slip, which will increase drag, and eventually it will decrease your airspeed and increase your fuel consumption as a result. Use the autopilot, try different modes, heading, nav, vertical speed, flight level change, vertical navigation, and approach. Use more advanced features like descent planning or fuel management. If you're flying a steam gauge airplane, you can calculate your true airspeed and wind speed using the tools available. For example, GTN 650 that can do it for you if you input the correct numbers. Hand fly. can you make your track look like it was flown on autopilot? It's always nice to look on FlightAware and see that how well you did. Is your track looks like it's a straight line, or you have a lot of S-turns on the way? Is your altitude constant, or you constantly went up and down? Try to be as close to an autopilot quality as you can. Practice emergency. Know the boat face items by heart. If it's a long cruise, try to remember a boat face item for an engine failure or an engine fire, and plan your descent. Don't just wait until you're above the airport and then cycle down to enter the pattern. If it's actual IMC, well, you can fly some portions. Again, flying by hand in the clouds, it's a skill that you need to practice. You can also use autopilot for other aspects. For example, you can hand fly part of the way, then use the autopilot to get some rest and get ready for the approach. You can get established on the approach on autopilot, and then when you're established, there's nothing else left to do except watch the autopilot fly. And at that point, you can disengage the autopilot and hand fly the rest of the approach to give you hand flying practice. Landing, again, fly practice approach. You can do it by hand with a safety pilot and a view limiting device, or you can do it coupled alone, because it doesn't matter if you're IMC with a view limiting device or totally visual, you still will press the same buttons. The only difference is that you still need to look outside and see and avoid. Multiple runways, land with a crosswind if it's possible. If the traffic pattern is full, you don't want to be the only one going for a completely different runway, but if there's no one around, pick up a runway with a crosswind for practice, because in real life, you might have only one runway, and if it's crosswind, you'll have to land with a crosswind. Do a soft field or a short field or simulated engine out landing, especially if you're entering the downwind. At that point, you can just pull back the power and make a power off landing. Would be a great emergency practice. All flights, they provide a lot of training and proficiency opportunities. For example, if it's flight number 3, syllabus 7, you need to do steep turns and slow flights. So try to do the steep turns as perfect as you can. Also talk through what you do. It will help you to focus on the important things, like being coordinated, and it will help you on Form 5, but also it will give your cadet a better understanding of what you're doing. Same goes to slow flight and imminent stalls. Even if the stalls are imminent, you can still do a proper recovery with power and flaps. Again, practice different types of takeoffs and landings. You can explain to cadets what you're doing and why. It would be more fun for them. And the same thing, takeoff with a crosswind, landing with a crosswind. If you have multiple runways, use them to your advantage. But maybe don't do it on the first flight. You don't know, maybe that cadet is a nervous flyer and you want to start with something more easy for them. But if it's a first flight, then ask where their house is and enter the coordinates in the avionics by creating a user waypoint. Would be a good practice for creating waypoints. With so many things you can possibly do, what should you actually do on the flight? Well, think about what you're not so good at. What is your weaknesses? And what you haven't done in a while. That would be your priority. Also think of what you might be asked to do on a Form 5. Can you incorporate it in your flight? Just something to keep in mind that the regulations don't really allow you to do proficiency elements on your flight. So that's the text from the regulations. But the summary is, don't do steep turns or stalls on the way. Don't stay in the traffic pattern to practice landings. All your training goals should be an integral part of the flight, like flying a route or landing. You still can do a crosswind landing, just do it once instead of 5 times, as you would do on a proficiency flight, like A12 proficiency flight. And now let's talk about the A12 mission. Get an IP to fly with you. Remember that cap IPs are free. Go for a cross country to an airport you haven't been to, but plan well first. And that's much more efficient than going somewhere you have been already. Fly at night, keep your 9 currency. You might have to go on a night search and rescue mission. Use the time efficiently. Flying 30 minutes to a place you've been already isn't as useful as doing steep turns and short field landings for 30 minutes. And as a summary, any flight can be a proficiency flight with the right planning. Be honest with yourself. Think of your weak areas. Work on things that are not easy for you. Avionics proficiency is as important as stick and rudder proficiency. Use A12s as intended. The funding is there for you. And of course, a rusty pilot is not an asset, but a liability, and CAP cannot afford it.